My dead husband came home a week ago. He keeps acting like nothing's happened. The past year had me riddled with anxiety, and only until recently did I find the dread-filled pit in my stomach become quenched by relief. It's a strange, blissful feeling. The feeling that one's little secret will remain that way until death. I'll be upfront about it. There's no point beating around the bush. I murdered my husband just over a year ago. We'd been hiking when a quarrel led to something more spiteful, more vicious. It was raining heavily, and as we'd neared a small cliff, wherein I had judged that a fall from it would certainly not kill anyone, I had pushed him. Yet what I had failed to calculate was that he'd fall and hit his head on a rather sharp rock, killing him instantly. I was so frightened. I leapt down immediately, noticing how much blood had pooled beneath his crushed skull, splashing upwards at me with each pulsing raindrop that fell onto him, onto us, like the blood was trying and failing to splatter back at me in retaliation for what I'd done, to mark me externally in the same manner that guilt and fear had done internally. I did what any normal person would have done, and called the police and ambulance services, explaining everything that had happened, bar a few crucial details. That my poor, dear husband had slipped from the torrential rain and lost his footing, tumbling backwards to his demise. It wasn't hard for the police to believe my tale. With no previous mentions of abuse, verbal or physical, they quickly accepted my story as fact, and the gushing words from my in-laws and his friends cemented it on the official report. It's funny, isn't it? The way that pervasive guilt makes crocodile tears flow with ease. It wasn't an unwelcome sight to see a bereaved spouse crying a fountain at their love's funeral. That's the point of marriage, till death do us part. But no one ever expects it to happen so soon, so early in the binding contract. We'd only been married for 2 years before I murdered him, and had been high school sweethearts long before that. The sympathetic hugs and pats that wrapped around condolences allowed me to crumble more, to feign pain in a fantastically authentic way, the performance of a lifetime, till death do us part. And in death, he had parted from me, and the role of victim had been unceremoniously reversed. I was the victim now, the victim of purely unfortunate circumstances. The thing is, though, is that guilt is an incredibly difficult emotion to shake off. It wraps around you like shackled vines, covering your mouth and ears in a thick smoke that clouds your perceptions. And as guilt takes its hold on you, it provides more leeway for its lever to sink its icy claws into your back as well. Paranoia. Following the funeral, paranoia engulfed me, followed me wherever I went, which was mostly just from the bedroom into the kitchen. I was terrified of being called out in the lie, that any moment a policeman would come knocking on my door, having found the slightest beacon of truth cracked through my fabricated story. I had considered turning myself in many a time, but with each day that passed of me withholding information, the greater the consequence of my actions. Technically, what I'd done was more akin to manslaughter than murder. I hadn't planned on murdering him whatsoever, just spooking him a bit. I hadn't premeditated it either. What I feared more, however, was that the care and sympathy that etched my loved ones' faces throughout the whole ordeal would be replaced with disgust, horror, and anger substituting pity. I'll admit that I liked it a lot. The feeling of being cared for so much, like I was a mere baby, cradled by the words of assurance and love, little encouragements that made my life so much easier. It was a free pass from any mistakes. Work became less heavy, and the permission to engage in alcoholic indulgences more often than what was healthy was also prevalent. It was a high I'd never felt before, the feeling of being excused from the mundane normalcy that everyone else had to trudge through. I suppose you could call it something akin to Munchausen syndrome. Without the need to actively self-induce illness to garner the attention I so desperately needed. My dead husband has done that all for me. I was finally free from the shackles of societal expectations, and slowly but surely, I was able to overwhelm the guilt and paranoia that had once overwhelmed me. I had won, and gained nothing but the benefits of it all. That was until a week ago. Sitting on my sofa, whilst languidly sipping red wine, the lock to my door began to jostle, as if someone had a key to unlock it. My mind went straight to my mother-in-law, who'd had a spare set made in order for her to come and hand me a freshly made casserole. She'd done nothing but coddle me since her son's death, and I had to quickly hide my gleeful grin with a more sorrowful expression. Standing up and hiding my drink, I walked into the hallway to greet her. Except it wasn't her. It was my husband. I shrieked in fear, the feeling of bile threatening to unleash blood-red spew from my mouth. He was there, in his suit, smiling at me with blinding teeth that could have melted the hearts of any spouse desperately wanting to be reunited with their other half. Could have, should have, but for me, I felt nothing but abject horror.
Whoops, sorry, honey. Didn't mean to frighten you.
He smiled sympathetically as he took off his suit jacket and hung it on the coat rack. He waltzed towards my rigid frame and enveloped me in a strong hug. He was warm and his breath hot. He was real. His flesh wasn't that of a reanimated corpse. He was alive. My ear that was pressed against his chest could hear the low thumping of his heart, pumping blood. I could barely speak. I pushed away and ran to the bathroom, hurling muddied and reddish vomit into the porcelain basin. He shot in behind me, holding my hair up as to not get it sodden.
Oh God, honey, are you all right?
He asked, love and care dripping from his words. I simply continued to vomit.
Shall I get you some water?
He'd asked, and before I could respond, he'd already gone and fetched a glass. He held it to my lips, and the cold fluid cooled the acidic burn in my throat. How are you? I'd finally managed to mutter out. My tone croaked.
I know.
He sweetened, rubbing soft circles on the small of my back.
I was swamped at work today, but at least I'm getting paid overtime. Boss said I'm due for a promotion soon. I was thinking, maybe we could go on a nice weekend getaway, or
I'd interrupted him. You're dead. You died, and I felt my breath grow louder, raspier, and I knew a panic attack was fast approaching. The clamminess in my hands and on my temples told me just as much.
Oh, did you have a nightmare? It's okay. Shh.
He started, picking me up off the bathroom floor and ushering me back into the living room, setting me down on the sofa, whilst whispering sweet nothings in my ear. I never would have thought that such honey-ridden words would bring such wasp-like stings to my psyche.
It's just a nightmare, sweetheart. I'm here now. It's all right.
I don't think we stayed up for much longer after that. I silently tiptoed around him, nervously trying to gauge if I was having some intense hallucination, that my paranoia hadn't really left, and was punishing me for being so complacent in the past few months. I remember being unable to sleep that first night, his shallow breathing jerking me back to reality. I'd wriggled out of his grasp when he slept, as though his warm touch scolded me with each lingering moment. The next morning, he'd disappeared, and for a moment I'd felt relieved that maybe I wasn't insane. Yet the indent of his pillow brought me back into a state of shock, and told me I wasn't truly absolved of his presence. He was downstairs in the kitchen, making breakfast, the humming that left his lips, swirling into the music that emanated from the radio.
Pancakes? I thought you might need them this morning.
He beamed, his shirtless, muscular frame hidden only by an apron adorned with flour. To any other love-struck wife, this would be a dream. a perfect achievement that life was bliss. To me, it was unfurling rapidly into a nightmare. Did he know? Did he remember what I'd done? Had I dreamt this whole past year up? Had I been stuck in a sick fantasy that made me crave his disappearance? "I'm not hungry," I stated, more spitefully than I'd intended. Like a wounded puppy, he frowned, before rushing over and placing the meat of his palm against my forehead. It was still warm, still real.
"Oh, are you still sick from yesterday?"
He worried, and it took every muscle in my body to prevent myself from slapping his hand away. Finally, he released me.
"You don't look very well. I mean, you look fantastic, as you always do. Just a tad under the weather."
He kissed my cheek, and the wetness from his lips sent ice shivers down my spine.
"Shall I call your work? Tell him you don't feel well?"
He asked, and I nodded rigidly. He smiled warmly once more.
"Okay, you go off to bed. I don't want you dying on me."
I remember how gut-wrenching that last sentence was. For a moment, I thought I saw a darkly humorous gleam in his eyes, like he'd caught me in a trap, like he was toying with me. I turned on my heel and ran back up the stairs, slamming the bedroom door behind me. I remember how I paced around the room, biting at the skin around my nails until they became sore and pink. A knock on the bedroom door made me shoot into the bed, pulling the covers over my head and pretending to be fast asleep. He'd come in, and the weight beside me on the bed told me he was close, and growing ever closer to my exposed ear.
"Honey?"
He inquired, in that sickly sweet voice that I'd long since forgotten until the past few hours. A finger brushed the hair by my ear, lovingly I assumed, but all I'd felt was lingering torment. He must have thought I truly managed to fall asleep that quickly. A dark chuckle left his lips, before exciting squeals racked his chest, like a child who'd been allowed an ice cream for behaving well. I was so focused on keeping my body still, on the thudding of my heart, that I hadn't realized his mouth being mere inches from my ear.
"Till death do us part."
Then he'd left. I waited there for what must have been an hour, frozen in place. He did know. He knew exactly what I had done, and he was toying with me. This was my judgment day. After I'd decided enough time had passed, I gingerly left my bedroom, tiptoeing around and noticing that his car had gone. The kitchen was spotless, so he must have cleaned up. My perfect undead husband had left for work. I went on Facebook. No messages left with condolences from his friends. In fact, the entire post I'd made about the passing of the love of my life had completely disappeared without a trace. All the photos of my family events that had me looking solemn and shy were now replaced with almost exact replicas, except for the smiling face of my dead husband peering at the camera next to me, his large hand clamped around my waist or shoulder, as if he'd never died. I couldn't stand it. Everything I'd gained, everything I'd worked so hard for, was cruelly ripped from me. It was like I'd died. I was no longer the poor, grief-stricken wife. I was the happiest and luckiest woman in the world. It destroyed me from the inside out. I needed it. The sympathy, the victimhood. I craved it, stronger than ever before. This must be what opioid addicts feel like, when the euphoria is so suddenly stripped from them. The cold shaking of my fingertips felt just as much like withdrawals. So, I decided to kill my husband again. This time, make sure he was really never going to come back, never ruin my life again. I went out for a drive and bought some sleeping pills. Lots. Just over-the-counter stuff, but strong ones nonetheless. A few bottles, one being his favorite wine, and a couple of steaks to make his favorite meal. I'm not that much of a villain, you know. I'm kind enough to at least send him out with one last hurrah. I slaved away in the kitchen, making sure that the steak dinner was piping hot and ready to be consumed once he'd walked through the door. I'd even lit some candles as well, and dressed up nicely, putting on makeup in the exact way he liked it. I practiced in the mirror, The bashful looks and fluttering of lashes that were just coy enough to give him the implication that I was going to give him, my dear husband, everything he'd deserved. He'd arrived home and picked me up with glee at the sight of what I had prepared, swinging me around and peppering kisses all over my neck. The girlish giggles I'd forced out of my chest were truly convincing, if I do say so myself, and we sat down in the living room, ready to eat. "I hope you like it," I said softly. A $1 million smile stretched over my face.
Oh, how could I not? This is perfect. You're perfect.
He lovingly gushed, cutting a piece of meat and placing it in his mouth. He moaned in pleasure.
Oh, simply divine. You really should become a chef, or write a cookbook.
I giggled once again, ignoring the nagging disdain that threatened to furrow my brow. "Oh, I forgot," I said, clasping my hands together in the most adorable way I could muster. "Would you like a glass of wine? I bought your favorite, 𝓐𝓾𝓼𝓲𝓬." It seemed impossible that his grin could grow any wider, but it did.
Oh, wow. Yes, please.
With that, I sauntered off into the kitchen, swaying my hips seductively as I left. Men are such fickle creatures, and hopefully any remaining doubts in his mind would soon be overridden with lustful thoughts. From the living room I could hear him muttering to himself, words along the lines of,
"What did I do to deserve her?"
and the like. I was ever so fortunate that my husband was a white wine drinker, and me a red, so bringing in 2 distinct glasses would be of no alarm to him. I'd already opened the bottle of 𝓐𝓼𝓲𝓬 hours before he'd arrived, filling the bottle with packet after packet of crushed sleeping pills, which had allowed enough time for them to fully dissolve into the pale liquid. I emerged back into the living room, placing his glass of wine in front of him whilst taking a sip from my own, and kissed him on his cheek. A small blush arose from him, and he gleamed with mirth. We continued to chat over dinner. A few seductive glances passed between us, before he swayed slightly, and fell asleep in his chair. I checked his pulse. It was still there. Slowly, his body crumpled onto the floor, the deep slumber rendering his muscles useless. Here was the tricky part. I could have left him there, to inevitably choke on his own tongue or vomit, which wasn't entirely out of the question, seeing as I'd put enough sleeping pills in the wine to kill a horse. But seeing his strong frame lay on the ground made me question if it was enough to kill him. If he'd survived, that would mean the money I'd wasted on this whole ordeal was worthless, not to mention another day of agonizing withdrawals from the ultimate pleasure of being pitied. So I changed out of my outfit and put on plain black clothing, with the washing up gloves on for good measure. Luckily, I still had a stash of COVID masks left over from the pandemic, and after placing one over my mouth and nose, along with a shower cap to prevent my hair from falling onto him, I got a hammer out of my husband's toolbox and stood over him. I had a few practice takes, swinging the hammer in the air to see what method would cause the most damage. Then, I got to work. I felt bad for him, of course, sleeping there blissfully like a baby. But like any addict, I would do anything to get my fix, so I smashed his skull until his entire forehead caved in. It surprised me how little force was needed to really get in there, near his brain. It was child's play, and rather therapeutic. With each splatter and squelch, I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. And though I hate to admit it, because I'm not really a psychopathic maniac, it was so unimaginably pleasurable. I was no longer forcing the giggles out. They racked my body uncontrollably. I cleaned up, satisfied that my work was complete, and dragged his body into the bathroom and placed him into the bath, allowing the shower head to help bleed him out. I checked Facebook once more, and everything was back to normal. The family photos, the post I had made about his demise, and the messages from his friends were all back to the way they were, the way they should be. That night, I slept so soundly, knowing that my once again dead husband was in the bathroom downstairs. But the next morning he was there, in bed with me, again. The feeling of his chest against my back, his arms wrapped around my body, warm, alive, just like nothing had happened. I sobbed so much. Once again, the desperate relief I'd desired was ripped so cruelly from my grasp. Venom laced my veins, and I turned to look at him, his eyes blinking from waking up.
Morning.
He smiled, kissing my forehead. I squirmed.
What's wrong?
I shot out of bed, grasping for breath. How could he do this to me? How could he claim he loved me when he denied me such needed pleasures?
Oh dear. Are you upset about last night?
He questioned, his eyes holding that taunting glint in them once again. I refrained from answering.
I really didn't appreciate that, you know. To think you'd be so naive to try and get rid of me again.
He chuckled before getting out of bed to approach me.
It doesn't matter, though. I don't mind it. You shouldn't try it again, though. You don't know how hard I've tried to make this work.
He nestled his head into the crook of my neck. He knew what he was doing, playing with me, hurting me. What the fuck do you want? I spat out, pushing him away. He wasn't startled at all. He just kept smiling sleepily at me, like I was the cutest thing on the planet. It made me sick.
I just told you. I want to make this work.
He repeated, scoffing like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I suppose it's time to come clean now. The argument we'd had, the first time that I'd killed him, was because I'd wanted a divorce. I was feeling trapped, like I hadn't lived my life properly, fully. I'd been with my husband since I could remember, as childhood friends, to dating as teens, to married as young adults. As my friends went out to party, to have fun, to fulfill fickle desires with one-night stands and toxic shags, I was working to provide for a life that I'd never known otherwise. He, of course, never wanted to leave me. That's when I'd pushed him away, to his untimely demise.
Till death do us part. Remember?
He kissed my hand, rubbing his cheek against it lovingly. I snatched it away and slapped him with the other. He didn't seem fazed at all, just continued to look at me with an enamored expression until I'd left the bedroom. Throughout the past week, I murdered my husband more times than I could count. I drowned him, electrocuted him, poisoned and suffocated him. I set him alight. I beat him to death. I even stabbed him right in the neck. But every time I killed him, he came right back, as loving as ever. He never fought back when I murdered him. He stared at me blissfully, even when I poured gasoline over his head or lowered the hairdryer into the bath. He just sighed with slight annoyance, but shrugged it off, chuckling at my failures, my incompetency. It drove me mad, but I had noticed my thirst for pity, for attention from grieving family members and friends, had began to diminish. I no longer craved seeing the messages pop up on my Facebook, offering condolences and such. Instead, I craved the feeling of getting rid of him. Tonight, I sat down and I had a conversation with him, one which finally opened my eyes. He'd cuddled up to me on the sofa as we watched some terrible telenovela rerun, and I'd simply let him shower me in affection. I'd given up on trying to push him away. "Why won't you die?" I asked, tiredly. He simply chuckled.
I thought we'd been over this, sweetheart. Till death do us part.
He kissed my cheek, curling his fingers in my hair. "So why won't you part? You've died multiple times by now, and you still keep coming back." He sighed, shaking his head. That same sickening sweet smile plastered on his face, as unwavering as usual.
It seems you didn't take our vows seriously.
He kissed again.
It's not till death do I part. It's till death do us part. I poured my heart and soul into those vows, which is why I'm still here. I'm here until we both go.
He sighed longingly into my neck.
You should count that as a blessing, really. You can hurt me all you want, but I'm still going to be right here by your side.
So, Reddit, think of this as my final confession, my plea for forgiveness. Forgive me, for I have sinned. but at least I will be here no more. My husband is sleeping soundly next to me as I write this. His fingertips clasp around my waist. He has no idea that I had left his car running all night. No idea about the hose I attached to the exhaust pipe that leads into our room from the windows, strapped to my mouth with tape. He has no idea that I took his words so literally, that he'd been so unaware of the lengths I'd go to squash his existence for the final time, even at the expense of my own. He's right. Till death do us part. So, it's my turn to depart. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this story. I definitely did, so thank you MouseCurtains for letting us narrate it. It was a wild ride, very twisted romance story there. Special shout out to Altered State Adventures for collabing with me on this. You'll be seeing at least one more collab on this channel with him in it. He did a great job, so go check him out. His channel's linked below. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story. See you next time!